Acupuncture. Listen to this, how about this? Acupuncture removes blocks to conception, redresses subtle imbalances, and by placing needles along the conception vessel meridian, prepares the womb for pregnancy, with a pregnancy rate of 60%. This is taken from The Guardian, so of course it must be true. But what a load of absolute anatomical nonsense. And I've argued this for a long time. And then I came across a friend from many years ago, who is practicing acupuncture in England, in London, with a very lucrative practice. And she kept going on about how her patients were having acupuncture, then IVF, and they were all getting pregnant. And I said, yeah. And the argument went on for a year. And in the end, I said, you know what? We're going to do a randomized controlled trial, which we did, and which has now been completed. 157 women undergoing IVF, 79 had acupuncture plus IVF, 78 had IVF alone. They were randomized, and you look at the results, hopefully it's clear here. Look at the bottom line, 50% live birth with acupuncture, 18.7% live birth with IVF and no acupuncture. So I lost a rather sizable bet. It cost me a good dinner in a restaurant in London, and I went over all the figures and went over all the methods. I couldn't fault anything along the way there. Numbers are small, but a very definite, significant difference. Maybe I was wrong, but I doubt it. Reflexology, Bowen technique, the endocrine system and the pelvis are addressed. Now what that means, I don't know. Or do you say, hello endocrine system, hello pelvis? After 2 sessions, 13 of 23 pregnant women were pregnant. Again, written down, recorded, but who believes it? Homeopathy. The idea here is that you dilute anything by 1 in 10,000 parts, and this will cure you. Listen at this, transubstantiation of inert substances by shaking and diluting them endlessly. Well, alternative medicine's been spreading. This is a fairly old slide. It's taken from a few years ago, but already more than 6% of the general population, at least in Israel and Holland, where I've worked, are using alternative medicine in order to get pregnant. And that number is up to 20% in both the USA and Australia. The Dutch Patient Union, Freya, which is a very powerful organization, it's the patients' organization, they recommend all of the alternative treatments. In fact, it's easier to get a grant now for a study employing alternative medicine than it is for conventional medicine. There's a lot of money available in Germany. In the USA, you can get it from the NIH. And in the UK, of course, His Royal Highness Prince Charles is a very strong supporter of alternative medicine. Here you can see him asking the surgeon why he's taking out the appendix instead of using homeopathy. There's been all sorts of data, clinical trials using a Senjing pill, acupuncture for severe oligospermia, sperm parameters improved by selenium, all sorts of vitamins, extremely diluted pollen cures hay fever, all published in very reputable journals. Favorable effects of prayer on coronary care patients, and this one I like, acupuncture to correct breech presentation, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And in the US, astrology. That's what does the trick if you want to get pregnant. So astrology will come onto the NHS as well. So Liam Farrell, who writes for the BNJ, came to the conclusion he's a strong believer in integrated medicine. After every consultation, I give my patients a teddy bear to cuddle and play them a tune on the banjo. He reckons this is great treatment. A few years ago now, we wrote about the place of IVF. Where should it be used? It should be used as primary treatment. I think everyone will agree. Mechanical infertility, severe male infertility, for oocyte donation, surrogacy, and PGD. I don't believe it should be offered for primary treatment for the hypog patients, anovulation, PCOS, and mild and moderate sperm problems. All these have easier and cheaper alternatives to IVF. But what about unexplained infertility? What should be the approach here? Well, this came from Gleicher. IVF should be offered as first-line therapy to all infertile couples, regardless of the type of infertility. What a load of balderdash, but I'm not terribly surprised as it comes from Gleicher and the Americans. But this is absolute nonsense and was published in Fertility and Sterility. If you use IVF for absolutely everything without any other treatment, it's a bit like treating a boil on the finger, instead of lancing it and using antibiotics, is amputating the arm. It's exactly the same. Why use a sledgehammer to treat something that can be so easily done? Now, unexplained infertility covers about 25–30% of all the cases that we see. As you know, it's a lack of a diagnosis, and there have been several definitions. Most of them include 1 to 3 years of regular unprotected intercourse when the tests for ovulation, tubal patency, and semen analysis are all normal. Now, we're going to need IVF more and more, and there's going to be more cases of so-called unexplained infertility because sexual intercourse is going out of fashion. You can see, and this was published by the National Survey of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles in the UK, published, I think, in the BNJ, people having less sex than they did in the 1990s, and you look at the figures for 2010, 2012, way down. I don't know what the reason is for this. Maybe the advent of mobile phones and people are playing with the mobile phones rather than with other things. But nobody has offered an explanation for these figures. So, when should we be intervening in unexplained infertility? I think most people will agree, if you're over 35 years old, a female, 1 year is enough to intervene. Less than 35, especially those who already have children, then you're probably better off waiting for 2 years before intervening. So up to 30% of all couples presenting with infertility after 1 year, if you don't intervene for 3 years, somewhere between 30 and 60% will conceive without any intervention. So I think we have to divide our unexplained infertility into good prognosis and a poorer prognosis. You see here, good prognosis, less than 2 years infertility, less than 35 years old, previous pregnancy. We're much better off probably leaving those alone rather than the poorer prognosis, over 3 years infertility, more than 35 years old, then of course it's worth intervening. Just one word here that we label several patients who may be 40 years old or older as unexplained infertility, when really we're talking about a reduced ovarian reserve. A few studies now comparing IVF with IUI and ovarian stimulation. In this case, 1 cycle of IVF against 3 cycles of IUI. Ongoing pregnancies, almost exactly the same. Less than 2 years infertility, less than 35 years old, were found to have a similar chance of pregnancy with or without IUI, or with or without IVF. Again, evidence that with a good prognosis, leave them alone. So this is a study from Holland where it was suggested that 544 patients with unexplained infertility, some they called the overtreated group. That's those who had treatment within 6 months of having the diagnosis or having no diagnosis, versus expectant treatment when no treatment was given at all. And it turns out that if you do intervene quickly, or whether you leave them alone, then the results, ongoing pregnancy, exactly the same. So what possibilities have we got for treating unexplained infertility? Well, I'm going to drop 2 of those out because IUI on its own and gonadotrophin stimulation and clomiphene and IUI have been found to be pretty useless, which leaves us with expectant treatment, gonadotrophin's IUI, or IVF ICSI. Why use IUI? It seems ridiculous if the sperm is normal, and why stimulate ovaries which are ovulating normally? Well, the excuses are superovulation may overcome some subtle defect in ovulatory function, it will increase the number of eggs available, and it increases estradiol levels. Whereas doing an IUI with normal sperm, how does that help? Well, you have a greater density of good motile sperm placed closer to the oocyte, and the timing is usually much more accurate. So if we're going to compare the treatment of unexplained infertility using either IUI and COH against IVF, what we have to take into account is the efficiency, multiple pregnancy rate, complications, dropouts, and the cost efficiency. Now, IVF, you will agree, is more invasive, has more complications, less compliance, a higher cumulative dropout rate, and it is more expensive when compared to IUI. People have said, yeah, but with IUI you get more multiple births. This is no longer the case. You actually get more multiple births in IVF than you do in IUI. Admittedly, these figures are the official figures from 2009, but ones a bit later had a similar story. Live birth rates, are they so low with IUI? Well, apparently not. If you give IUI and proper ovarian stimulation for 3 cycles, then you can achieve a live birth rate or ongoing pregnancy rate of around 25–27%. And these are good figures. Cost efficiency, I don't think there's much doubt that IUI is much cheaper than IVF. And these are a few of the studies that have been done. Just the bottom line here, an updated Cochrane database, no difference in live birth rates, IVF versus IUI plus stimulation, very little difference between the two. And then the National Institute for Clinical Excellence in England, NICE, comes out, NICE being the Bible in the UK for treating our infertility patients, and they came out with this extraordinary statement saying, give expectant treatment for 2 years, if they're not pregnant by then, go straight to IVF. I got a problem with this because there's no evidence at all for giving this recommendation. And we did a survey of members of the British Fertility Society, and 136 members of this society responded, and only 16% actually agreed with the NICE recommendations. 30% would definitely not change their process of IUI, so it didn't go down very well. Since then, more evidence has come about, especially from this group in Holland, and this is a massive study. 600 couples randomized into 3 groups. One group had IVF, 3 cycles with single selective embryo transfer. One group 6 cycles of IVF with modified natural cycle, and one group 6 cycles of IUI and stimulation. And as you can see, live births identical. We did our own study, which was actually initiated before the NICE guidelines. What we wanted to examine was patients who'd never had any treatment, 3 cycles of IUI and stimulation versus 1 cycle of IVF or ICSI. We randomized 207 patients. The first author here is Anupa Nandi. This will be published next month in Fertility Sterility. What I can show you here mainly concentrate on the live birth rate. It was almost 22% with the IUI and 34% with IVF. Now, IVF obviously came out better, although this was not significant. But these are large numbers. We had 100 in each group who were randomized. I think the point that should be made here is that if you don't do IUI, then 22% of your patients will be prevented from having a live birth with the simple treatment of IUI rather than going straight to IVF. Are we overusing IVF? Well, you can see how the so-called diagnosis of unexplained infertility has gone up from 2000 to 2011. 18% of the IVF cases were unexplained infertility in the year 2000. This has risen to 32% now. The conclusion was that IVF treatment is effective if the subfertility is greater than 4 years. If it's less than 2.5 years, then don't go straight to IVF, use alternative treatments. So the conclusion from this is there's no convincing evidence to indicate a change in policy to use IVF as the first-line treatment instead of stimulated IUI. Leaves me with the last slide. It just shows you always have to examine before you actually believe anything. Thank you very much for listening.
In the area of personalized medicine. Our next speaker is Dr. Chris Yap. Just a couple of details on Chris. He's an independent consultant working in technology and futures thinking. He has over 30 years experience in the IT industry and have worked with IT giants including HP and Microsoft. He has been involved in future of education for over 20 years and has written and lectured in many countries on the challenges of personalized learning in the 21st century. He's a graduate of Magdalen College, Oxford, and holds a honorary degree DTech at Glasgow Caledonian University. He's a fellow of Royal Society of Arts, and I'd like to invite Chris to give his talk.
Thank you, and I'd like to add my thanks to EBO for the generous hospitality and the opportunity to share with you some ideas on the road to personalised medicine. Every few weeks now in the UK and across Europe, and especially in the States, there are conferences after conferences, and personalised medicine is one of those big topics that people are talking about. They're talking about it more than they're doing it, I think would be the fair description, I think, of the state of where we are. So what I want to try to do is to give you a sense of the journey that I think medicine is on and some of the challenges, because I think you'll see when I show you some of the arguments around this, that there's a lot to do, and people may try to push it too fast. And I think that clinicians need to get ahead of this rather than allow policymakers to try to drive something before it's ready. I think it would be essentially there are three things I want to do in this. I want to start by actually asking about what can we know about the future. You know, I mean, we all know that there's lots and lots of famous examples. Bill Gates, 640k is enough for anybody. Thomas Watson of IBM, I can see a market for maybe 5 computers in the world. You know, we have a pretty bad track record of forecasting. So I want to try to give you some insight as to how to think about the future. And I also want to try just to describe briefly some tools for thinking, some ways of organising your thinking about how you can further personalise and how you can bring some things in. And then I want to talk about personalised medicine example, and I'll give you some of the oddities that we're seeing. And I recently did an event with senior management of the NHS. This was a very, very hot topic for those people who do it. I thought I'd start with a quote of one of the great futurists and public intellectuals of our time. I never predict anything and I never will, dear old Gaza. You know, I think it's... So let's have a look. And there's a series of questions up there. You know, what will be the price of Brent crude on a particular date? What will the average age of a UK-based woman given birth the first time in 2020? Will there be a civil war in China? Do you think that you would have a better insight into some of those questions than others? Would you feel happier giving an answer to some of those questions than another one? Yeah? So which one would you feel least comfortable doing? Anybody?
Financial.
Right? Brett, yeah? Okay. I'll let you in on a secret. Michael Gove actually had a point when he said we're sick of experts. And that is, all those people you see on the television, writing pundits, have no better insight into the future than you do. You are as likely to be as accurate on any one of those questions as a China expert, as somebody who's an oil trader. And I want to try and show you why, because I think it's very important. There's a phrase that goes around in future circles, is expertise provides no insight. And I want to try and show you why that's the case. So, the question is, there's a guy called Phil Tetlock, and he's been studying people's predictions for about 40 years. Lots and lots of papers published. And then a couple of years ago, he wrote this book called Super Forecasting. And what's important about it is that there are some people who are much, much better at forecasting the future than others. And the thing is that he's got a group of them, and he can fire them any of those sort of questions I had up there on any topic, and they actually come up with better forecasts than experts in specific sectors. And he's based his model that he's been using for some 30 years on a model that came from the Oxford philosopher Isaiah Berlin called The Fox and the Hedgehog. And the hedgehog knows only one thing. They only see one way of the world. They have a dominant picture of the world. Whereas foxes have many, many different ways, and every problem they come up with, they tackle in a different way. And the really interesting, just imagine you're down the bar, down the road, with a group of strangers, and they discover that you work in health, so they start talking about the state of the NHS. If you were entirely surrounded by hedgehogs, there might be, say, a Catholic, and the first thing they talk about is abortion. There might be an animal rights expert, you know, and they would start talking about testing on animals. You then switch the story to the rise and fall of Leicester City, and what happens? The animal rights person knows nothing about football, but he doesn't know why they're nicknamed the Foxes. So the thing is that they have a dominant model, and the big problem is for most people, when you're going about your day-to-day job, the hedgehog mode is the one that dominates. People who think like foxes and tackle things in multiple ways actually are much better forecasters And that's why putting lay people on committees improves the expertise of committees. And there's lots and lots of evidence for it. So it's not just a nice to do, it actually improves the ability to forecast. So one of the organisations I do work with, they actually have Fox time. And they actually have this idea that when they're facing it, they say, is this a Fox meeting or is this a hedgehog meeting? And it gives people permission to step outside their own expertise and actually start to do it. So let's look at it. One of the important things, an old colleague of mine from Hewlett-Packard, Bill Sharp, was very, very unhappy with these timelines that people do. 2018 we'll do this, 2020 we'll do that, 2025 we'll do this. And that kind of forecasting we don't actually find very helpful because people tend to make big mistakes with it. And what we found is this model, which he developed about 5 years ago, actually is much better. So you've got 3 horizons. The first horizon is the way we do things now. So if I walked into 100 clinics, 90 of them will be doing this. So those are all of the things that dominate the way we do it. The second horizon is the kind of things, the innovations that we're playing around with. There might be 10 or 20 of them that people are doing. It's the kind of thing that you come to talk about at practitioner conferences, like this one. The third horizon is the thing that's maybe, there's one example somewhere, like a womb transplant, which is not very common. And the question is that going to change the way we do things downstream? And if you just stand there, you can see if you go forward in time, the first horizon starts to decline. Some of the innovations of the second horizon start to become important. And some things way out that just sound totally science fiction or weird start to become part of the new second horizon. And so you can start to push in there as you go forward, and you can start to make intelligent judgments as to when you think this is going to hit you, your clinic and your discipline. Right, so my interest in personal medicine came about when I went to hear the head of health globally at IBM, who did a talk on the next 10 years in medicine. And he was talking about artificial intelligence, data, big data and analytics, the empowered patient taking control of their ingestion, and robotics, things like remote surgery and all sorts of different things. I'll let you in on the central point. That was 1986. I could stand up today and virtually give the same presentation he gave in 1986. And apart from changing 1 or 2 terms, it would largely be pretty much the same. And that it's therefore very easy to be cynical and to believe that somehow this will never happen. But I want to try and show you something quite important here. I'm going to give you an example from a different sector. How many of you have got a Kindle or an e-book reader? Okay. How many of you have out of copyright books, say a Jane Austen or a Scott Fitzgerald or something like that on your book? So a number of you, okay? So the point is, what you've seen, and most of you will think about the last 10 years, we didn't have e-book readers and they came out of virtually nowhere. It's not true. I'm going to go back to 1944. A guy called Vannevar Bush, who was in the White House, he was the founder of ARPA, the ARPANET, and therefore the internet. Set up the research agencies for post-war reconstruction in there. And in October 1946, in the Atlantic Review, he wrote a paper, The Way We Will Think. And he introduced this concept of the memex. In 1965, Ted Nelson invented hypertext. That was 6 months after the mouse was first demonstrated. And in 1965, he invented the idea of micropayments. Every time you click on that link, on the web, that was Ted Nelson's work in 1964. 1971 was Project Gutenberg. That was the attempt to get a very precise time in a very precise location. What we've done in Chicago, to give you one example, is they can now grow tomatoes in vertical farms inside buildings using 5% of the water that it takes to grow tomatoes in the wild, using 1/10 of the nutrients. That's the kind of level of efficiency. In medicine, the idea, and I don't know how long it's going to take to get through the medical approvals in the States, the idea is to be able to strap something onto your arm and be able to give you very, very small amounts of doses. So the idea in some areas is that instead of saying, give me 75 milligram tablets, this is the range I want this patient to be in, put it on there and deliver small amounts of the medicine to get them into that, set maximums for a 24-hour period, but keep them in that sort of level. That's the kind of technology that is there, it's being demonstrated, but it's still not got through medical approval. I've touched on this real-time monitoring of home and work, and of course medical robotics, for example. The fertility knickers one might sound strange. If you could put sensors into bras and knickers and into men's underpants, and you could measure that you could download the contents of their underwear at the end of the day, what could you know about that patient that you don't know now that would be a very expensive treatment? Now, this sounds, this is weird stuff, but we can do it. It is there, and it will give us that ability to be able to look at at our patients. And the interesting thing, of course, is that in the United States, the cost of not complying with medical regimes is about £11 billion a year. That's quite it's a significant cost. So if you were able, from a T-shirt or a watch, to be able to tell if a patient wasn't taking their medicines, what would that do to your cost of patients? But finally, this is quite a complicated slide, so bear with me. I try and point out, this is the work of a neo-Schumpeterian economist, you don't know what those are, ask Jill, called Carlota Perez. I mean, what she's done is done an analysis from the Industrial Revolution up to the modern times. And there is a repeating pattern, and it's very important here, which is that somebody invents something. It takes time to get it to the point where you can mass produce it. You then get a bubble, the dot-com bubble being a big one, but the Industrial Revolution, whatever. This is where you create new millionaires, billionaires, and no doubt in time trillionaires. You lose middle-class jobs, the rich get richer, the poor, inequality gets wide. The bubble bursts. If you read the book about the Great Train Bubble in 1848 and taken out railway and put bank in, you couldn't tell the difference between the bank crisis. The technical bubble breaks down, takes about 2 years to recover from. About 5 years after that, you get a financial bubble. It crashes. It takes about 10 years to recover from the financial bubble. Sound familiar? But then you get the golden age on the other side. And when you get into the golden age, you get narrowing of social inequality, the creation of more middle-class jobs. And the reason that that structure takes about 30 years in the first one and 30 years in the second, you can see these patterns. So if she's right this time, somewhere about 2020, 2022, we will enter a new golden age. And what we will start to see is the creation of better quality jobs, more interesting jobs, more jobs requiring new skill sets. But also we'll need to build new models of organisation. So, what are the real challenges? If you go to a conference on personalised medicine, what are the things that I think you really need to focus on? What are the skills of the medical staff? Are we recruiting the right people at 18? Are we doing the right continuous professional development? These are the problems. Is it right that people need 4 A's at A level in sciences to go to medical school? Is that the model for the future? There's a whole issue of the ethics and conduct of clinical trials in an era of personalised medicine. Let me give you an example on that. How can I do a double-blind, randomised clinical trial with summative assessment on you? I did a review with the IPPR, one of the London think tanks, on 192 pilots funded by the NHS on telemedicine none of which have gone mainstream, but over 100 have in other countries, including Spain, which actually, interestingly enough, had the highest take-up. And the biggest problem was the medical mindset was that the randomized clinical trial was the only way of evaluating, and in some cases, it isn't. But I think we really do need to start thinking about what the ethics and conduct of clinical trials in this area. It has a huge issue on the psychological contracting relationship between the doctor and the patient as we start moving to personalised medicine. Let's take an example outside your area. If I make a personal medicine for liver cancer just for you and it doesn't work, can you sue me? Or does it have to work 100% of the time? That's a really big challenge for us to be able to deal with. The whole issue of how we regulate the personalised world. Will HFDA league tables make any sense when personalised medicine arrives? And finally, cybersecurity, and of course I've got to mention it, but just two examples that actually do something. Somebody published a paper at one of the hacking conferences recently showing how you can actually switch off a pacemaker. One of the commercial pacemakers actually has his Bluetooth enabled, and they're actually able to switch it off. Just imagine being walking down the street and actually being able to switch off somebody's pacemaker. That's serious. That's a lot more serious than the I thought I might show you that in case any of you have missed the headlines. Hopefully he will be moved on after June the 8th. That's all I will say, but I just think you might have to do it. So, the point is, the science, the technology, all of these things are coming together to be able to start moving towards a more and more personalised world. But the issues are not the science and the technology. They are the ethics, the values, system. But one final example. I want to show you an example I hope that you all know about, because it's really quite important. And it's the Open University. I have the great privilege and pleasure of working with Michael Young, the inventor of the Open University, for the last 7 years of his life, as a trustee of the School of Social Entrepreneurs, the last of the 100 and something bodies he set up. In 1969, there were 150,000 students in higher education. In 1994, its 25th anniversary, there were 150,000 students in the Open University alone. Look at what it did. It built a campus with no students, set up summer schools. It moved from individual academics to academic teams. They had a TV studio in the middle next door to Walton Hall. New models of feedback and assessment, and they developed kits for home experiments. And they also did, for instance, virtual microscopes to enable somebody with profound handicaps to actually do science experiments. You didn't change the education system by putting TVs into classical universities. You built an entirely new model of what a university was and how it might operate using television and video recording. So the real challenge now is to think about how would you design the health system so that it was an open health system that worked in the clinic, in the home, in the office, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We've been in. This is the kind of thing. The likelihood, I think, is it's going to come from outside the current health service. Apple had enough money in the bank to run the NHS for 2 years. If Apple decided to open up hospitals, do you think they'd build them anyway like the way we do them now? Google are working with the NHS through their subsidiary DeepMind. What if Google started opening hospitals? They've got the money. What would be their model? So I just want to say something that then final about personal medicine. I actually do think you are leading the way towards personalised medicine in affairs. I think the integration, the dealing with the lifestyle factors, dealing with the medical interventions, you are ahead of many of the other areas. And I think the point is, you ought to be trying to influence some of the others. But in order to stay ahead, I think we start needing to think very broadly about the kind of possibilities of what we might be able to do. The thing that slows everything down is the rate at which we can develop the skills and competencies of professionals to be able to manage these things at high level. That's the challenge. How will we need the legal framework to develop? The current HFBA Act isn't fit for an era of artificial damage. You'll need a new primary legislation to deal with that. We may also need new legislation post-Brexit. Demand management and early intervention. If I could have a wearable computer for a teenager that actually helps them deal with obesity, would that be better value than treatment? One of the points that Jill made here. And then finally, it's the whole societal challenges of this model. You know, we can do this for very wealthy, very exhausted people. Can we do it for everybody? At what point can we actually roll this model out in here? And I think that, you know, we will start to know that personalised medicine is really arriving rather than just being stuff at conferences, when people are talking about how we engage the public to understand how we're going to change it. If you think health is slow, you should try education, and if you're in both, you'll know how deeply complex and frustrating this is. So I hope that's been helpful, giving you an outsider's view of what we're up to. Finished. Thank you. I mean, that varies. I think if we end up with the Royal College of Medical Robotics, and we end up with yet more science and the Royal College of Health Informatics, I don't think so. The way in which, for instance, if you take something like robotics across, is this something where all the colleges should join together and work on a common curriculum and then specialise in their own discipline? Or, you know, so I think with those potential, I absolutely agree. The IPPR, one of the think tanks, is to work on the future, and actually the Royal College have identified a big change in those next 20 to 30 years. So I think it will be. Absolutely, that's why I said I think the question needs to be more far-sighted and start thinking of, so around, you know, how would you organise so that companies like atılıyor don't need it. They're trying to protect the current way of operating. You know, we will not be able to take advantages of the progress in a whole variety of technologies unless we change the way we structure. And as I said, if you've got the ability to manage the patient 24 hours a day, you know, from home, work, travel, whatever, how does that change the way we do it? What gets done in the clinic? What gets done in the medical? All of those things we've got to start thinking through. If that's what's going to take us to time. think one of the big problems, and that Carlos Perez model I showed you there, where you go into golden age, is that it does take you to rethink